When you picture ancient China, you might think it's this super rigid place where, like, who your parents were decided absolutely everything.
Yeah, that's the common image, definitely.
But then you look at the Song Dynasty, maybe 1,000 years ago, and, well, that picture gets way more interesting. Think about this statistic.
Okay.
In the Tang Dynasty, just before them, the top degree, the Jinshi, right? They awarded that to maybe 23 people a year on
Pick
average.
23. Okay, pretty small number.
Then the Song Dynasty comes along, and suddenly that number jumps to around 340 every single year.
Wow. Okay, 340 versus 23. That's huge.
Huge difference, right?
It really is. It kind of forces you to rethink that whole idea of a static, unchanging ancient China. This wasn't just like a minor adjustment.
No, exactly. It feels like a fundamental change in how government worked.
Right.
And that's what we're diving into today.
Right, the imperial examination system.
Yeah, the Song Dynasty's exams. How did they possibly manage this, huge wave of new officials? What were they actually testing? And maybe crucially, how did they try to keep it, well, somewhat fair?
We're kind of digging into how this massive empire tried to build its whole bureaucracy on talent. Or, at least the idea of talent.
And we'll be using historical records, some really good analysis to sort of paint a picture of this pretty pivotal time.
Yeah, it gives us a fascinating window into what they actually valued and the big challenges they faced trying to govern this enormous, complex society.
Okay, so let's get into the why. Why this massive shift? What happened that made the Song Dynasty suddenly decide to expand these civil service exams so much? Why the big focus on scholars?
Well, to really get that, you have to look at what came right before the Five Dynasties period.
Right, that sounds messy.
Oh, it was. Think serious chaos, lots of violence, constant fighting for power, and a really big drop in population. The old, powerful families had mostly disappeared, and people were just tired, really weary of military rule.
So, like, everyone was just exhausted by the instability and conflict.
Totally exhausted. And Emperor Taizu, the guy who founded the Song Dynasty, he made a very deliberate choice. He actively worked to lift up Confucian scholars and push down the power of the military governors.
Deliberately.
Very deliberately. There's this amazing quote from a big historical record, the record of the continued comprehensive mirror for aid in government. He basically said he'd rather have 100 corrupt scholars in charge than even one cruel military guy.
Wow. Even if all of them are corrupt, they will not cause as much harm as one military official. That's really saying something.
Isn't it? And the thinking was, okay, maybe we get some bureaucratic problems, some red tape, maybe even corruption.
But it's still better than warlords and constant fighting.
Exactly. Imagine a society so fed up with war that they actively choose potential government inefficiency over military strongmen. It really shifts your perspective on their priorities.
It does. So this fear of military power was the initial spark, not necessarily a belief that scholars were inherently perfect rulers.
I think that's right initially. It was more about containing the danger they knew unchecked military might. They probably figured, how much damage could a scholar really do, even a bad one?
Uh-huh. Of course, history often shows that things don't always work out exactly as planned.
Hey, no kidding. Long-term effects can be quite different.
Which brings us back to those numbers. Because this decision to boost civil governance, it directly led to that explosion in Jinshi degrees.
Yeah, from that 23 a year average in the town.
To around 340 in the Song.
Yeah.
More than 10 times the opportunity.
It's just staggering.
And if you look at the totals over the whole Song Dynasty, like 320 years, it's over 60,000 regular Jinshi. Plus another 50,000 through special routes.
60,000.
Yeah. Compare that to other big dynasties. The Tang, over almost 300 years, just over 6,600.
Huh?
The Yuan Dynasty, less than a century, only about 1,100.
Tiny in comparison.
And even the Ming and Qing, famous for their exams, right? They had maybe 25,000 and 27,000 respectively over similar long periods.
So the song really stands out massively.
It really does. I mean, think about it. Tens of thousands more chances for people to climb the ladder based on their brains, not just their birth.
The sheer scale of what they were attempting is pretty remarkable. Building an empire run by officials chosen through exams, it was a bold experiment.
Definitely bold. But you mentioned consequences earlier.
Right. That huge number of successful candidates eventually led to its own problems later on, especially in the Ming and Qing. You ended up with too many officials, like a bureaucratic logjam.
Ah, the classic unintended consequence. Okay, so let's zoom in on the exams themselves. What were these hopefuls actually tested on? What skills, what knowledge did the song think was most important?
Well, there were basically three main paths, three main subjects you could be tested on in the song exams.
Okay, what were they?
You had policy discussions, interpretation of the Confucian classics, and poetry composition.
Hmm. Policy discussions sound the most practical, right? Like
Huh.
testing if you can actually solve government problems.
You'd think so, yeah. But funnily enough, that was maybe the most controversial option.
Really? Why?
Because the examiners had this, like, catch-22. If they asked really specific questions about current government stuff,
They risked giving away secrets.
exactly, state secrets, potentially. We even have this account from Suzy. He was Su Dompo's brother, the famous poet.
Oh, great.
Yeah, Suzy reported that the Liao dynasty, their northern neighbors, were actually paying big money to get copies of the song policy discussion exams for intelligence.
Wow. Okay, that's a serious problem.
Yeah.
You don't want your rivals reading your government's internal memos.
Definitely not. So the alternative was to ask more general questions.
But then,
But then the criticism was that these general questions were too vague, too predictable, just abstract essays that didn't really show if a candidate actually understood how to govern.
so they weren't testing real skills.
Right. There was this top scholar from way back, Sun He, who basically called them empty and exaggerated cliches, said they didn't prove anything.
Huh. So they were stuck. Test practical stuff and risk leaks. Or test abstract stuff and risk it being meaningless.
Pretty much. A fundamental dilemma they ran into early on. How do you test real-world ability without compromising security or just getting, hot air?
That's tough.
Yeah.
What about this thing called ancestral stories in the policy questions? What was that about?
The ancestral stories, that basically meant precedents. Good examples, decisions made by earlier Song emperors or officials.
Okay, so like case studies, historical examples.
Kind of, yeah. The idea was future officials need to know this history, these precedents, to make good decisions themselves. Learn from the past, build on successes. Makes sense, right?
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. Learn from history.
But here's the catch. These ancestral stories, this internal history, wasn't always public knowledge.
Huh. So not everyone could easily access it.
Exactly. It was often seen as like insider information. So if you tested candidates on it, who would have an advantage?
People from well-connected families. Insiders.
Precisely. People from more privileged backgrounds who had access. And that directly clashed with the Song Emperor's goal of using the exams to increase social mobility to let talented people rise regardless of background.
Right. It's like asking job applicants super specific questions about internal company jargon. It favors people already in the know.
That's a great analogy. It really highlights that constant tension, wanting knowledgeable officials versus wanting a fair shot for everyone. You can see why they kept tweaking the system.
Okay, so policy discussions were tricky. What about testing the Confucian classics? That seems like a natural fit, given how important Confucianism was.
Oh, absolutely. Confucian values were the bedrock, and understanding the classics was seen as key to developing ethical, moral officials.
So that must have been less controversial.
Well, yes and no. Interestingly, you had these two huge political rivals at the time, Wang Anshi and Sima Guang, fierce opponents on almost everything else. But they actually agreed that studying the classics was way more important than writing poetry for the exams. They both thought poetry was too flashy, maybe, superficial, not serious enough for future governors.
Huh. Strange bedfellows on that point. Both wanted to get rid of the poetry part.
Yep. Both advocated abolishing poetry composition as an exam subject. Seems they look back at the late Tang Dynasty, saw perceived decadence, and maybe blamed poetry culture partly for it.
So a strong push towards Confucian scholarship then. Sounds straightforward.
Oh, but hold on. While they agreed the classics were important, they had totally different ideas about how to interpret them.
Oh.
Yeah. Both Wang Anshi and Sima Guang had their own schools of thought, their own interpretations, and they were both pretty dug in. So what did that mean for exam candidates?
You had to pick a side.
Mm.
Or guess which interpretation the current examiner liked.
Pretty much. You essentially had to tailor your answers to align with whoever was in power or whoever was grading your paper. So it could still end up favoring people who were good at, political maneuvering rather than deep understanding.
Right. Not exactly a pure test of knowledge or independent thought then.
Not necessarily. And there were other criticisms too. Su Dompo, the famous poet.
Yeah. What did he think?
Surprisingly, given his background, he also had issues with testing classical interpretation. He argued the number of possible questions was pretty limited, and the actual knowledge needed wasn't that advanced. He felt it just wasn't a good enough way to measure real intellectual horsepower.
Interesting. So even a master of literary arts saw problems there.
And then you get an even sharper critique from someone called Bizongyu.
Okay, what was his take?
He was clever. He started off praising the classics, saying how vital they were, standard stuff.
Buttering them up first.
Right. But then he argued that because the classics are so deep and difficult, candidates often just resorted to, like, superficial interpretations. They'd quote trendy theories, maybe even twist meanings, just to sound smart and impress the examiners.
So faking it.
Essentially. He even mentioned candidates throwing in ideas from, like, the Tao Te Ching or Buddhist texts just to seem profound, trying to game the system.
Wow. That sounds kind of cynical.
Yeah.
Using sacred texts opportunistically just to pass a test.
That was Bizongyu's point exactly. He worried this whole approach wasn't fostering genuine belief or deep understanding. It was creating opportunists. He felt the exam, in that form, was actually making potential officials less moral, not more.
That's a really powerful criticism. It really shows how hard it is to test something like real understanding or belief with a standardized exam.
Definitely.
Okay, so that leaves the third option. Poetry composition. Bizongyu seemed to think that was the best of a bad bunch.
He did, yeah, though his argument fell a little weak, honestly. He basically said, look, poetry isn't super practical for governing, we know that. But, he argued, because poetry has strict formal rules, rhyme, meter, all that, it kind of limited how much candidates could just brown nose or parrot specific opinions. They were constrained by the form.
So his argument was more about limiting the ways people could cheat the system rather than poetry being genuinely useful?
Pretty much. Less room to maneuver politically within the poem itself was the idea.
Could they still game it in other ways?
Well, exactly. As our sources show, even if you couldn't easily twist your opinions in a poem, you could absolutely tailor your writing style.
Ah, style over substance. Catering to the examiner's taste.
Precisely. Which brings us neatly to that great story about Yangshu.
Right. This illustrates the point perfectly, doesn't it?
It really does. So back in the early Northern Song, there was this writing style that was really popular in the Imperial College, the top academy. But critics, like Wu Yangshu, thought it was really dense, obscure, hard to understand.
Okay, a trendy but maybe difficult style?
Yeah. Wu Yangshu, on the other hand, was a huge champion of what he called ancient prose. Clear, direct, straightforward writing. He really hated that obscure Imperial College style.
So he had strong opinions on style.
Very strong. And when he got put in charge of the big Imperial exam in 1057, he basically decided, right, I'm going to stamp out this bad style.
He used his power to enforce his preference.
Absolutely. His main target was this guy named Lu Ji. Lu Ji was famous for always getting top marks in the Imperial College exams, sort of the poster boy for this obscure style Ouyangji hated.
So Yangshu was gunning for him.
Totally. The story goes, Ouyangji is grading papers, comes across one that's written in this really convoluted style he despises. He immediately thinks, this must be Lu Ji.
Assumed it was him.
Yep. And he just marked it as a fail right then and there. Didn't even bother reading it properly, apparently. Just, boom, rejected. Which, in their grading system, was pretty final.
Harsh. What happened?
Well, Lu Ji failed spectacularly, and so did a lot of other people associated with that Imperial College style. Meanwhile, guys who wrote in a clearer style, like the relatively unknown Su brothers, Su Shi and Su Jie, did really well.
So a major shakeup, basically decided by the examiner's taste in writing style.
Exactly. But there's a twist.
Oh, do tell.
A few years later, Wu Yangzhu is chief examiner again. He sees Li Ji's name on the candidate list and thinks, right, not this time, pal. He's determined to fail him again.
Still holding a grudge.
Seems like it. So he finds another paper written in what he thinks is that same wrong style and boom, disqualifies the candidate instantly.
Okay.
Then he finds another paper. This one is clear, straightforward, strong arguments, exactly the ancient prose style he loves. He's thrilled. Awards at first place, top mark.
He found his ideal candidate?
He thought so, but then they unseal the papers to reveal the names.
Uh-oh.
The candidate he disqualified on the spot. Turns out it was some poor guy from the South who probably had no idea about this whole style debate in the Capitol.
Oh, man. Innocent bystander.
Totally. And the brilliant paper he awarded first place. The one written in the perfect style he admired.
Let me guess.
It was Lu Ji.
No. The irony.
Right. Despite Wu Yangshu's best efforts to fail him based on style, Lu Ji not only passed, but got top marks from Wu Yangshu himself, who mistook his writing for the style he preferred, and he failed someone else by mistake.
That is just... wow. What does that tell us, though?
Well, a couple of really important things, I think. First, it actually shows that the management of the exams was pretty strict about anonymity. Wu Yangxu clearly couldn't tell for sure whose paper was whose.
Ah, so the system to prevent bias had some effect, even if he tried to game it.
Exactly. But second, it shows that even with poetry or essays where you might think it's less about specific opinions, the examiner's personal preferences, in this case, writing style, could still hugely impact the outcome.
So catering to the examiner was still possible, just in a different way.
Yep. And maybe, just maybe, it also suggests that real underlying talent or intelligence might find a way to shine through, regardless of the specific exam format or even stylistic fads. Luigi clearly had something going for him.
That's a fascinating story.
Mm.
So even with all these debates, policy versus classics versus poetry, and the problems with each, the song were trying to make the actual process of grading fair.
It seems so. That Wu Yangzhu anecdote, his mistake, really underlines the effort they put into anonymous grading, trying to stop examiners from just promoting their favorites. It was a key part of trying to make it less about connections and more about merit.
Okay, so let's recap a bit. We've seen this just unprecedented scale of the Song Dynasty's exams.
Mind-boggling numbers, yeah.
The really intense debates about what they should even be testing, practical policy,
Mm.
moral classics, literary skill.
And the major headaches with each of those options.
Right. And then these efforts, like anonymous grading, to manage the whole process and keep it somewhat fair, even though personal preferences could still creep in, like with Yu Yangqiu, it sounds like a truly massive, complicated undertaking.
It really was. They were wrestling with huge questions. How do you find the best people to run a country on a massive scale? How do you balance practical skills, moral grounding, intellectual ability, all while trying to stop corruption and give people from different backgrounds a chance?
Yeah. It makes you think, our source mentions it briefly, about the later shift to the eight-legged essay in the Ming Dynasty.
That very rigid format.
Right. Maybe, even though it seems kind of stifling and maybe not very useful for real governing, maybe it was another attempt to level the playing field, to make it even more standardized, reduce that examiner preference factor.
That's a really interesting thought. The eight-legged essay, with its super strict structure, could absolutely be seen that way. A way to minimize subjectivity, even if it sacrificed creativity or practicality, trying to make it fairer in a procedural sense.
So, looking back at the song, their whole effort to build this merit-based bureaucracy through exams, it was just incredibly complex, wasn't it? Full of these difficult trade-offs.
Absolutely. No easy answer.
And it really makes you think about today, evaluating talent, potential, leadership. We still face similar challenges, don't we?
We really do. Those dilemmas the song faced. Balancing different kinds of knowledge, ensuring fairness, guarding against bias, actually measuring what matters. These are perennial issues in any large-scale testing or selection system. Education, hiring, you name it.
So thinking about that song experience, what do you think are the built-in limits, like the inherent problems with any big standardized test system that's trying to pick out future leaders or experts? It makes you wonder about that balance, access versus preventing cheating versus actually measuring the right things.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do you design a system that's fair, secure, accessible, and actually identifies the qualities you truly need? The song certainly didn't find a perfect answer, and maybe nobody ever can perfectly. Well, this has been fascinating, and if you're still interested in the glorious Tang Dynasty, you can take a look at my 4-hour video about the Tang Dynasty.
We genuinely love to hear your thoughts on this. Jump into the comments section and let us know what resonated. Which type of wealth are you focusing on?
Yeah, let us know.
And hey, if you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.